Well, this is a core issue that my work tried to deal with. And I tend to think that a broader understanding of the deep state is the most useful. It's really about trying to understand the regime that we live under, the system of governance we live under, and how it does not conform to the ideas about democracy and civics that we learn in high school and such. That it's really a top-down kind of despotism, but with a sort of democratic disguise. And so the deep state, in the bigger systemic sense, you could say that it is all of those institutions that allow for top-down governance in a nominal democracy. Now, but people also use, myself included, the deep state to refer to the dark, secretive, lawless part of the state, like the clandestine state, the part of that which is sovereign, which gets to decide when the law will and will not be obeyed. That part that the top of the regime commands and can use to assert its ultimate power over life and death and the power to override the law. Like that's something that we could think of as the deep state. So if you think of if you say the deep state killed President Kennedy, for example, you could say that in the systemic sense, that we do have a media that will cover up the state crimes, that we have a political system that is unable to adjudicate high criminality. So we could say it that way in that bigger sense, or we could say there were elements of the intelligence community and the military security complex and organized crime intertwined as parts of the clandestine state, which acted on that day to assassinate a sitting president. So it works in both ways. And I think that the central, whether we want to quibble over definitions and precision, which is what social scientists like to do, the elephant in the room is that we do not have a democratic regime. We have a top down regime that has a cover story of democracy, and that this is something we're going to have to grapple with as we try to reform this thing, which is now unwinding on the global stage. I thought that the interview was very interesting and important, historically important.
Do the
And
United
I
States
think
need
that the
this?
media
What for?
predictably tried to suppress certain things about the
Thousands of
interview that
miles
were the
away
most
from their national
important, like the
territory.
fact that Putin is a competent statesman whose motives are rational and actually comprehensible and understandable, and who is also willing to work with the West to end the war in Ukraine and to solve other global problems as long as the West, really the US empire, is willing to accept Russia's right to exist as a sovereign nation state with the ability to conduct its own domestic and foreign policy, which is, of course, what the US empire does not accept really anywhere, but especially with a country as powerful as Russia, which has the ability to intervene in foreign policy like they did in Syria, where the Russians basically intervened to stop an illegal US regime change effort. So there are many reasons why the West is so anti-Putin. He basically is a big impediment to their plans to be the global dominator, to be the unchallenged empire that runs the world. And so he has to be vilified in every way possible. And yet the facts are pretty much on his side. The Russian publicists, propagandists, PR people, they're in a good position as far as people in their line of work go because they really mostly just have to tell the truth about what U.S. policy has been and what U.S. intentions are. The US people have it a lot harder. They have to lie constantly and smear people and elide so many facts and keep people from understanding key facts, that this is sort of the way that they function by and large. So the interview, I think the one weird thing about the interview, which they people did comment on sometimes disingenuously, was that he went on a little long about the historical background of Ukraine. I think he was trying to establish this sort of historical connections between Russia and Ukraine and how the borders of Ukraine were drawn arbitrarily and often by great powers. They were drawn and redrawn over time, and that this is something that should be put into historical context. The problem with that answer was that I think he took it for granted that Americans actually know the fundamental facts about the invasion and about what Russia's problem was with the regime that was installed by the US in 2014. that he assumes that people understood some of these things when actually they don't. Most of the American public has been kept in the dark as to what led to this war, as to the way that the war unfolded in its early days. They believe that Russia invaded with the intention to destroy Ukraine, like the Blitzkrieg or something, and that the Ukrainians stood up and fought them to a standstill, just like the Nazis were defeated as attacking Moscow, back in the 40s. So they really misrepresented so much here about this. I mean, in reality, Russia invaded in order to make Ukraine come to the negotiating table. They almost hammered out a peace agreement, which was obviously in Ukraine's interest because Ukraine could not hope to defeat Russia militarily, which Russia knew. And Russia basically wanted to force their hand to say, you must not make yourself into a weapon against Russia right on our border because you've joined up with the United States who's dead set against us. So he did not explain some of those things as clearly as he could. I think that was an error on his part. He had a discussion that was geared towards people of much greater erudition, perhaps U.S. diplomats or other people. Who even knows who his target audience is with that part of it? But the rest of what he says was very sensible, and his position is actually reasonable. And I think that if people are objective about it and they look at what they thought about Putin going into the war and Russia going into the war, when you see how just deranged the US has been sacrificing so many Ukrainians to into this meat grinder while we say, "Oh, we're your friends. We're your help friends in the United States. We're going to help you." But when you think about what the US has brought to that country since that coup, the CIA abetted coup in 2014, and you look at what has been done, you see that the US is indeed very dangerous, very murderous, will murder hundreds of thousands of its friends, and has stated openly that it seeks to dismember Russia as a nation state. So I think that Putin has largely been vindicated, and it's only just sort of establishment imperial inertia that keeps people from like stating the obvious here, which is kind of a good microcosm of our whole situation. There are so many obvious, terrible imperial situations that are indefensible. These different crisis points, but almost invariably they trace back to the U.S. imperialism and U.S. policies and U.S. attempts to stick a beachhead of Western imperialism somewhere that it didn't belong, whether that's in the Holy Land or in Ukraine or the island of Taiwan. Like all of these flashpoints are basically easily traced back to US or to Western imperialism and US imperialism if you're going to be honest about it. I think he was trolling Tucker and saying that wanting the audience to understand that Tucker, even as he takes some iconoclastic and contrarian, anti-establishment stances, is a guy whose connections to the CIA are very dubious if you think about what the myths are about American journalism as this like free press that's not a state media, and we have our liberal freedoms and such. But like, why is the media so intertwined with the CIA? Why are they sending this guy? So when he said later in the interview, he said, "Oh, your guys blew up the Nord Stream." He says, "Your guys did it," and he's like, "Well, maybe not you, but the CIA." I felt that was very funny later in the interview. He really kind of zinged him on that, and Tucker couldn't even really say anything. I've thought since I saw his interviews with Oliver Stone that he's a reasonable, sensible person and a surprisingly relatable person given the amount of power that he holds in his historic position. I mean, people should go back and watch Oliver Stone's Putin interviews. They're actually much more interesting and illuminating, and allow you to better understand the Russian situation and what Putin's position in history really is. My parents are both from West Virginia, and were not wealthy people. They were kind of working middle class, something like that. And my dad grew up on like a farm with like seven brothers and sisters, and was basically farm labor or the early part of his life. And his dad eventually got a job at a chemical like factory, maybe Dow, something like that, in Charleston, West Virginia. But the family was out there on the farm, pretty far away from that. And I grew up in Southern Indiana, so I'm really all American, white person. I think 1/16 Native American because one of my great grandparents is Native American. I've only know that from a photograph my grandmother showed me. So, but I think, because my mom worked for a congressman, a Democratic one, and was against, Ronald Reagan in the '80s, I was critical of some aspects of US foreign policy, like the Iran-Contra affair. I remember that growing up. I saw JFK in the theaters, as a kid when it came out, and so some of these things planted different seeds in my mind. My early adulthood was under George W. Bush when I got out of college, and 9/11 happens. I'm in Taiwan, and I for a year teaching English because I didn't really want any corporate job or political job. As soon as I come back that month, like a week later, you have 9/11 and George Bush, and so that made me even more kind of disgusted about US politics, but I eventually worked on a campaign in '04 for John Kerry's, the DNC, basically fundraising and canvassing, doing other stuff, and then in '08, I worked for Barack Obama, thinking that he would prosecute Bush's obvious crimes. That was really something I thought he would do because why wouldn't he? He's a constitutional lawyer, and the other party had committed these crimes. You could really deal a devastating blow to the other party, which in theory is what you would want to do in a two-party system. But it was an education when Obama ended up being more or less the second and third terms of George W. Bush, or the whatever the eighth or ninth term of Ronald Reagan, however you want to whatever you want to say it as. It really showed me that this system, there's something deeper there, and so I began studying the JFK assassination. I saw Oliver Stone on Bill Maher, and he talked about this book, JFK and the Unspeakable. And I read that, and I read the work of Lance DeHaven Smith, a professor at Florida State University in public administration, who wrote about state crimes against democracy and how the US has, the political system has been damaged by interventions from the secret government or the clandestine state, the national security state, into politics, as with the assassinations of JFK and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and that these are state crimes against democracy. And that these need to be understood because you can't really have a functional democracy when it's a fake democracy where the oligarchy and the regime has a veto power over any kind of democratic politics, up to and including assassinating a sitting president, something to which the political establishment cannot respond to in a lawful way. And so it just sits there in the historical record, in the national consciousness, that some things like that can happen. The president that the people elected, who was the most popular president in the history of Gallup polling on approval ratings, he can be shot in broad daylight. His brother is the attorney general, and nobody can do anything about it. That's the staggering level of power and duplicity that we see at the top of this regime, and it is a hard thing to grapple with, even theoretically, thinking about what do you do about this. And zooming out, what I can say and what I have decided or come to believe is that the bigger issue is the fate of all empires, which awaits this empire as well, and this regime. I mean, the reason that they have this kind of secret apparatus with a veto power over democracy is that you can't run a global empire as a democracy. You can't let people in one country vote to have the kind of government they want and let the people in the US vote to have the government that'll be what they want and will suit their interests. That is just not how a global empire could ever work. And so we're not despots like the Mongols, who are just like, okay, let us take over your village, or we're going to rape all the women and kill all the men, and take all your shit. We have a different approach. We're the liberal good guys, which means we just have to have all the murder done secretly, covertly. So my own personal background, which was very middle American, in some ways, it was, I don't exactly know why I was so drawn to study these things and to go at things, even though I knew they were very controversial. There's really no career incentive to do that. I guess like I have a similar mentality, but that to somebody like with Aaron Bushnell, except I didn't really self-immolate. I just sort of self-immolated my own chances to have a political science career in the mainstream of academia. But what do you do when faced with this kind of evil in the world? This is I don't have the answer for it, but maybe you can try to take a different path career-wise and put your minds to trying to work on these issues and illuminate what's going on, because I don't know how to beat this thing more than anybody else, or somebody would have done it already. Well, I did have jobs in politics, like canvassing, which were very interesting. I got to walk around and meet all kinds of people and just talk to people about politics. In 2004, especially, I did a lot of this, and that was very interesting. I learned a lot about what especially because we were on around Philadelphia and we were going to neighborhoods with money, and some of these are disproportionately Jewish because they have like mezuzahs on all the houses, right? So what's interesting now is we have this Gaza issue going on is that I met a whole lot of Jewish people, and they were actually my favorite people to talk to as a group, if you can believe it, because they were generally more to the left, and even though Bush was kind of a neocon pro-Israel regime, he wasn't popular among Jewish Americans. So that's also something very interesting to think about. But it allowed me to have a view of a lot of different parts of American political life, and I got to talk to people with different political perspectives, and that was valuable. It made me more convinced that the whole idea of like, oh, America's so polarized and there's this left right divide, that a lot of this is kind of manufactured, and that really most people that you would see that you would consider to the left or to the center or to the right, almost no one, I mean, really supports what the US empire really is and does. Nobody really looks at these things honestly, like, and looks at things like the US blowing up Nord Stream, the US overthrowing the Ukrainian government, the US supporting Al Qaeda type people before and after 9/11 as terrorists, sort of foreign policy proxies. Nobody really defends these on their merits. They have to deny them. They have to say, "Oh, that's not what's happening. What happened is not what happened. It's actually this other version that I read about in the New York Times or the New York Post or whatever." So that to me is instructive. It's not really the people, because the people have to be lied to all the time. If the people were really so horrible as all of this in America, even the right wing of America, then they wouldn't have to lie about what they're doing all the time. They could just say like, "Yeah, we're doing this because we can, because we're powerful and we can take what we want. And if you don't like it, you can lump it." They don't say that. They have all these ridiculous arguments about a make believe world that the regime basically presents us with. And that makes me think that there's more hope to with the people here than we would want to believe. And even more conservative Americans are not. Nobody is as deranged and right wing as the actual people who run the U.S. empire day to day. Like they really believe that they have a divine right to rule the world in perpetuity. And so I think that working in different jobs I've had, I worked at Blockbuster Video. I was a bus boy at a time. I worked at other restaurants as a waiter. I've had all kinds of jobs. I worked in education as a intern in the history department and a substitute teacher at a Quaker school. Taught history for a number of years. All these things have really been a huge benefit to see different parts of American life and think about, yeah, U.S. politics and society, from very different positions. I'm thankful for a lot of even the crappiest jobs that I've had because, they do teach you some things about the world. My mom growing up in politics and being interested in politics and understanding what makes the world work, having an interest in history as well, having an interest in justice. These are things that motivate me. Really having a hatred for war, because my mom worked with all these Vietnam veterans, and the Vietnam War seemed so incomprehensible and insane to me that I tried to understand, how that ever could have happened, which led me to study things like, U.S. imperialism, neocolonialism, the Kennedy administration, the Kennedy assassination. It leads to a lot. Trying to understand history leads to a lot of fascinating subjects that you can get into if you start to do it. And then the more that you know and understand history and politics, the more context you have to put other, parts into your own, bigger narrative or epistemology in your own head, that as you start to understand politics, it's more rewarding because it allows you to understand other episodes or to re-examine other things that happened in the past, based on the new knowledge that you have. So this is my own family background and interest just kind of drew me to this, and I sort of can't not do something in this vein, it seems. The book came about, it was originally an article that was published in 2015, which was before it was accepted for publication before I had even completed my doctoral coursework, before I'd passed my exams. So that was kind of a coup for me, and it makes the argument that the US is not really a democracy governed by laws, that it functions in a different way as an empire with a sovereign authority or power at the top that is covert and lawless, essentially, we have permanently, or whatever, we have institutionalized state lawlessness, and we've basically overridden the Constitution. I mean, you can talk about all the things that all the times we've practiced censorship, and other, violations of the Bill of Rights. But fundamentally, all these interventions that the U.S. has launched around the world, covert operations, bombings, straight up invasions, these are all violations of the UN Charter, which outlaws the aggression or the threat of aggression in foreign policy. And people can say, "Oh, well, that's just international law," which is meaningless, right? But not really, because the U.S. Constitution has the supremacy clause, which maintains that any treaty ratified by the Senate is the supreme law of the land. And the UN Charter has been ratified by the Senate, and thus it is the supreme law of the land. It is the supreme law of the land that aggression and the threat of aggression are outlawed in foreign affairs, in foreign policy. Now that they have ridiculous arguments about that, saying like, "Oh, well, the treaty, it doesn't have its own enforcement mechanism, so it doesn't really count." This is all just top-down legal, nonsense. Like, you can hire a lawyer to make any argument you want, and there's nobody more powerful than the people making this argument in the judicial or legal system, whatever. So that argument carries the day, but it's a ridiculous argument, and I almost like it when people bring up the argument, because it's so bad that it actually proves my thesis even more, I think. So I look at social science and the different ways of studying hegemony and empire as academic concepts, and how different scholars have tried to apply this to different times and places. So I deal with definitions of empire, definitions of and theories of the elite, and how elites dominate politics, especially from C. Wright Mills. And I look at the academic literature dealing with political clandestine high crimes, conspiratorial crimes carried out by the state. So people that study coups, the intelligence agencies' relations to the organized crime syndicates, assassinations, other covert operations like that, domestic and foreign. People like Peter Dale Scott, Lance DeHaven Smith. There's just a small number of academics who've worked in these areas. And so I built on what I could build on. And then I built on other academic traditions that are useful, like the, international relations, the realist school, historical materialist critiques of U.S. foreign policy and imperialism. I tried to draw from as many relevant academic perspectives as I could to make this argument. And a main part of the argument, since the subtitle is Empire and the Deep State, the American exception, instead of exceptionalism, the exception is the exception to the rule of law, meaning that the regime itself decides when the law is to be overridden, and then it does so. And that's kind of a routine part of our regime, which we are not able to really discuss in history class or in political discussions. So that's the American exception. I call it exceptionism, sort of the institutionalization of the abrogation of the rule of law, just a permanent kind of overriding of the law by the state. And the empire and the deep state part of it, obviously empire references the U.S. desire to dominate the globe, but the deep state part of it is a reference to what I call the tripartite state, meaning that we don't just have our American federal government. It's really a tripartite structure in a sense, in that you have the public state, which is, Congress, the president, all those things that we learn about in school. And then you have the national security state, the Pentagon hierarchies, the bureaucracies and the intelligence agencies, National Security Agency, FBI, Homeland Security, all of these they have state secrecy and a very hierarchical structure, and they're not really dependent on elections for a lot of their personnel. But we also have a third part, which is the deep state, which I would say is, you can As a shorthand, you could say that's oligarchy. You could say that is the empire. You could say that is fascism. You could say that is capitalism. All of these, you could say it's basically all of these things that are top down and that override democracy and the wishes of the people again and again. And this is this dates back to America's founding. Really, it was always kind of an oligarchy of property, and there's no king and queen. It's just America is a business enterprise. It was the Virginia Company and the Massachusetts Bay Company. Like these are corporations that are the beginnings of American colonialism, and it wipes out the indigenous people here. Goes from sea to shining sea, making money all the way. And then once they sort out the Civil War and the frontiers closed down, some people thought it's time to make this a more prosperous society that is integrated with itself and sustains itself because we have the resources and the manpower and the brain power and everything. But other people wanted imperialism. They feared that that would lead to basically a creeping socialism if there was no empire, if there was no frontier anymore. And so they went from sea to shining sea, and they went all the way to the west. And that happens at the beginning of the 20th century. The U.S. also enters into imperialist wars in World War I and World War II. World War II, they are triumphant. They're the most powerful country in human history. They have most of the world's manufacturing capacity, most of the world's gold, and they're the only major power that really was undamaged by World War II. There was no fighting on U.S. soil, unless you count Hawaii, which is very dubiously a part of the U.S. anyway, if you know the history there. So we were unassailably powerful, and perhaps it was a foregone conclusion that no country could have this much power without using it to pursue empire. I don't know, but either way, we, Wall Street oligarchs, decided during World War II that, hey, we're going to be able to enter this war and probably win, and we should have an empire afterwards. We need to make sure that we're able to run the world afterwards on behalf of free enterprise, and which really free enterprise is, of course, just a euphemism for capitalism, corporate power. That corporate power would be ruling the world afterwards. And that as a story that I try to tell. Now, the democracy part of it is always contested in the US. There are democratic aspects to American society. There are things that we could call progress in a democratic sense. And that was a problem for the people running the empire. So you end up with social movements and leaders like the Kennedy brothers, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, people that really could not be accommodated by what the oligarchy and the empire wanted. And so they had to kill them. And then they began changing the nature of American society, making it even more corporate controlled. And I think that a key cataclysm here is the election of Ronald Reagan. With Ronald Reagan, I think that the forces that were behind the 60s assassinations, behind the Vietnam War, behind the creation of the CIA, probably weird as it sounds, behind the removal of Richard Nixon, that all these forces had basically triumphed, and that they had consolidated their power with this mature deep state, a part of the U.S. regime. That really Reagan's election, I think, signified the victory of those people, those forces. And that's what we've been saddled with since. It's Reagan and Reagan and Reagan. No matter what, you cannot get away from that general Reagan revolution consensus. America's got to rule the world, be number one. Corporate America is in charge. And that's where we've been. And I try to tell that story in my dissertation, and then in the better updated version of it, which was published by Skyhorse, which is American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State. Well, it has in a sense, but that is a piece that's kind of what they would call a Carthaginian piece, or a piece that arrives when all adversaries have been just crushed and destroyed, right? So the U.S. has been the peacekeeper of a certain kind of peace that is a kind of unjust status quo that's really like neocolonialism. So they've kind of been the policeman for neocolonialism and the manager of global neocolonialism and really the manager of Western imperialism since the end of World War II. They consolidated Western imperialism under U.S. management. And that was really the meaning of decolonization. It was to be neo-colonialism. as Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana pointed out in his book Neocolonialism, for which he was later overthrown by the U.S. because he wrote it. This is what the U.S. has been. They have been a policeman or a peacekeeper of a kind, but it's really to maintain an exploitative imperial order that aggrandizes, especially the American oligarchy, but also other wealthy upper middle class people in the United States, and immiserates poorer countries and keeps them in a state of precarity and insecurity, and often makes their lives very short and miserable in places like Congo, many places in Latin America, much of the global South, the third world, places that have suffered under Western imperialism. Parapolitics is Peter Dale Scott's term that refers to the study or practice of politics in which accountability is consciously diminished. Okay, that's another way of saying it's a way of studying conspiratorial politics, or the role of conspiracy, covert operations in politics. Now, he wrote about this in the 70s as he was studying how the drug trade influenced America's involvement in Vietnam and how political assassinations impacted political history. And eventually he expands that into deep politics, which is really all of those things and subjects which are suppressed rather than acknowledged in mainstream political discussions. So that's his idea of deep politics. He got away from parapolitics, Peter Dale Scott did, because he felt that the term had kind of been co-opted or taken over by people who were not as judicious and sober with their methodology, sort of people you could call conspiracists, like not people interested in studying the role of conspiracies in the larger political economy, but people for whom the conspiracies are the alpha and omega, and really they are the system itself. That's what I would call conspiracism. And Peter's not a conspiracist, and I am not either. I think political conspiracies are institutionalized in our system, and that we need to understand how this came to be, and that therefore it's instructive to study certain political and understand certain political conspiracies like the JFK assassination. But parapolitics became something that was adopted by people who were more interested in just conspiracism, essentially. So Peter was motivated to start talking about deep politics. A similar thing happens when Peter sort of popularizes the term deep state in the West, but now because of Trump and other people, I think he doesn't like that term, which I sort of understand, but I feel that we're kind of stuck with it. And whatever, if we come up with another term that applies to what we're trying to talk about here, they'll just shitcoat that as well in some way or another. So I don't think we need to always be reacting to what they do and say to make us look bad. So that's parapolitics. Now, The Power Elite is C. Wright Mills' 1956 book is titled The Power Elite. And he was a singularly brilliant sociologist in the U.S. studying power. And he wrote about how democracy in the U.S. was a farce. It was a facade, that really all the decisions were concentrated at the top. The middle levels of power, like Congress and local leaders and labor unions, these were all basically in some sort of stalemate politically, canceling each other out in different ways. But that all the important decisions were made at the top, and especially they had made this decision that the basis of the U.S. economy and politics was going to be the privately incorporated permanent war economy. Okay, the military industrial complex. He laid this out. He was saying that we've basically had this decision made from on high that permanent war and the preparations for it are going to be the foundation of the economy. And this is dangerous, and it's leading us toward war, and it's creating this crackpot realism among the elite, the people at the top of the most powerful organizations in politics, the military, and big business, that these people had a kind of deranged mindset, a global dominance mindset, more or less, and that it was really detrimental to what we were doing, or to what we wanted if we were at all democratic or progressive or enlightened. It's notable that he was inspired to write this after reading, I think, the book Behemoth, which was a book written by a German German expat. about the rise of Nazi Germany, and he was looking at how these cartels and the oligarchy in Germany gave rise to Nazi Germany. And C. Wright Mills was thinking about how similar factors could lead to a despotic regime in the U.S. and that we already basically had it. And he was really prophetic because he is in his own mind in the writing he's saying it's hard to know between like all conspiracy and then all structure. That doesn't really work to explain history. It's not just people conspiring, but nor is it all just the structure of history playing out like a weather system or like tectonic plates. Like some people have agency to do things and make plans and see them work or fail, and the people have plans, the people that make plans, the people that have power, that is a function of the structure of the society. So in our society, corporate wealth is very organized and has lots of resources. And so those are the powerful people that can animate political life, whereas other people just don't have that kind of power and wherewithal. So he was on to some very important things, and he really did not know the half of it because he was writing about how I don't think that this whole thing is surfaced, but I don't think it's invisible either. Well, and he was really writing about ways that they could manage the world in secret, and he was doing so without even understanding the CIA, which was just really kind of in its infancy back then. So he was really brilliant about discerning these things with very little information. He was really kind of a prophet, and that's where the idea of the power elite comes from. And if we really were a place where the Enlightenment held sway, C. Wright Mills would be the main thinker that political science and scientists and social scientists, sociologists that they study if they want to understand America. But because we don't, he's kind of, he's not the main influence on what happened in U.S. social science, which I think is on purpose. We have a social science that is not up to the task because if it was, it would just be explaining to people the naked illegitimacy of the U.S. empire. Yeah, his theory of a tripartite power structure was that you had in the United States, there may have been different. C. Wright Mills had the idea that there were different eras of American power, and at some points you had this kind of this elite that was more worldly in the early days of the U.S. and had a different set of interests, but nobody really had that much power. There were different regional disparities and other aspects which kept people from concentrating power so much. But eventually, over time, and after the Great Depression and World War II, you have this new power structure where big business is extremely powerful, and they and their sensibility dominate the other two, the political system and the military. The military has been empowered to run the world in a particular way that suits the interests of the corporate elite, and the corporate elite, also the corporate rich, they co-opt the political system. And he says essentially that it's really ultimately the corporate rich that are calling the shots. So he's very astute in that regard. But that power structure is like, it's important to understand. You have big business in corporate America and the way that its organizations and hierarchies are organized. And you have the political system, but it's dominated by corporate money. And then the military industrial complex, or the warlords, the whole military apparatus in the United States, it was planned by a coalition of politicians and Wall Street oligarchs, and it serves their interests. And so really everything in the US in the power structure, in this tripartite structure, ultimately is dominated by money. And that more or less mirrors the tripartite state, where you have the public state, which is similar to the political realm. You have the national security state, which is similar to the military realm. And you have the deep state, which is similar to the corporate rich, basically. So I took his idea of a tripartite power structure and I applied it to the regime in the United States. Well, conspiracy theory is funny in that it's used nonsensically by establishment people as a way to preempt or a priori reject ideas that they don't want to entertain. So conspiracy theory is kind of a pejorative term, meaning like a thought that you are not allowed to think or a narrative that is anathema. But in reality, I mean, with the two words conspiracy and theory. A conspiracy is two or more people planning secretly some untoward act. And then theory is an explanation of something. So a conspiracy theory is a theory that posits a conspiratorial explanation for an event, for a phenomenon. So if you have a conspiracy theory of 9/11, might be that a number of Arabs conspired to plan a hijacking of planes and in order to attack the United States as an act of terrorism, right? Or the Islamist terror. Or another nine, that's a conspiracy theory because it's a theory that posits a conspiracy. Now, another conspiracy theory would be that the West has supported Islamist terror in order to advance imperialist goals that they couldn't advance otherwise. So you can put military bases all over the Middle East if you're fighting this something that's called Al Qaeda and there's a bunch of anti-Western terrorists. But ultimately, who is funding that? Because the people that are funding that, they're also funding something that gives an excuse for the U.S. to put military bases all over the Middle East, where there's a lot of oil reserves and so on. And so that's a conspiracy theory that you could say. And we know that this is a conspiracy that the U.S. has done, perpetrated various times, supporting Islamist jihadis. We know about much of this: Bosnia, Afghanistan, Kosovo, Chechnya, Syria, Syria after 9/11. I mean, those are theories about conspiracies that we know the US government does. So it's really a nonsensical term the way it's used by, say, the New York Times. It should be offensive to thinking people to see language in human, reason. I mean, language is what separates us from the animals, and we're supposed to use symbolic language to be able to speak clearly about complicated subjects and potentially use this communication to solve political problems and deliberate about them. But we bastardize language and weaponize it. So now you say, "Oh, that's a conspiracy theory. It can't be true." You're saying it because you're attributing something to a conspiracy of elite state-backed actors. That's beyond the pale. That couldn't be true. That's to be rejected. That's not serious. You must be a crank or something. This is the logic that they deploy when they use conspiracy theory as a generic pejorative. When it's hilarious because, in a sense, because the U.S. empire, has always, since the end of World War II, had to depend on elaborated conspiracy theories to justify its insane, sprawling existence. So it was the global communist conspiracy. That's what J. Edgar Hoover called it during the Cold War. And then they were kind of adrift after World War II, so they had to find these different conspiratorial groups like drug traffickers and Islamist terror to use as their villains for a while. But eventually 9/11 comes, and we have the new conspiracy theory, which animates all of U.S. policy, which is the global war on terror, the jihadist conspiracy to take away our freedoms, right? That serves for a while until uh, at some point, Russia, after intervening in Syria and messing up our plans there, Russia becomes the evil conspiracy. And that today it's Russia and China that are conspiring constantly. They stole the election for Trump and in 2016, and they're conspiring all the time. They probably blew up the Nord Stream even. They got blamed for that at one point by US pundits. I mean, they're the new conspiratorial boogeyman. We hear it all the time that they're going to intervene in our election. China's up there too. So they are as much they want to rule out conspiratorial thinking about the US regime in the face of vast amounts of evidence, with things like the Kennedy assassination or Russiagate being a hoax. Uh, then they'll say, "Oh no, that didn't happen. Don't say that. Don't be a conspiracy theorist." Meanwhile, they will have these conspiracy fever dreams about Vladimir Putin, about the Chinese Communist Party. It's really something. The absurdity of it all and the contradictions that are inherent in all this. I think it's reaching some sort of critical mass, and I don't know what's going to happen. It makes this a very interesting and kind of frustrating time to be alive. Well, this is a subject that I can and have spoken about for many hours, so I will try to summarize it here as best I can. But JFK represented a lot of the more progressive strains in U.S. politics, and it's hard to even say this in a way and feel good about it because the term progressive now, you just think of like phony kind of liberals who end up just saying vote Democrat all the time. But the New Deal and people like Henry Wallace really did have a different plan for the world, and for the US after World War II. They didn't believe that we should be the global policeman for Wall Street. They thought that there should be a what we would call a multipolar world governed by international law. That's more or less what Henry Wallace was saying, and he was Roosevelt's vice president. The oligarchs basically uh, vetoed Roosevelt's wishes to have him as the vice president, and they installed Harry Truman as the VP in the 1944 Democratic Convention. And as a result, he was more or less agreeable to the people, the Wall Street people that wanted the U.S. to go for global empire. But Kennedy takes office, and he is really shocked at the prospect of nuclear war. That's one reason that he wants to like wind down the Cold War. But he's also had to win an election in a country that has a lot of insane Cold War ideology. And if you had, even though the Cold War was basically a neo-colonial enterprise with a, an anti-communist cover story, but it was really about running the whole world. And anti-communism was like the perfect cover story for this. But you couldn't say that. So Kennedy spoke about peace, and he tried to use whatever he could to move in that direction while still appearing tough, quote unquote, tough enough to the U.S. political establishment that he wouldn't be, crucified by the media. So he did many things behind the scenes, but he also did many things very publicly. I mean, he gave the peace speech publicly, and he rallied the country to support a partial nuclear test ban as a milestone along the way to like abolishing nuclear weapons and having world peace and ending the Cold War, basically. And he said that in the months before he died, he gave the peace speech, and he got that treaty passed. And he also stealthily planned a withdrawal from Vietnam, where he essentially sent over the national security, or sorry, the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to Vietnam to do a fact-finding tour and write a report. But the report was already predetermined. It was going to call for troops to be wound down out of Vietnam by the end of 1965. But by having the Secretary of Defense and this high-ranking general sign off on it, it was a way for Kennedy to have political cover to do this. And he was undermined, and they reversed that policy, and they murder him, and we end up in Vietnam. So he was a person who I believe wanted to establish more of a multipolar world and international law, and this was just not what they had in mind. When JFK was killed, there are enormous covert operations in places where JFK wanted different policies, places like Indonesia and Congo. And now, in the decades since then, trillions of dollars worth of resource wealth was taken out of those two countries, just those two countries alone, making corporate oligarchs who were already rich now richer than beyond imagining. I mean, and we still have, people slaughtered in Congo. Millions of people have died in the decades since then. Kennedy supported Lumumba. He was devastated by Lumumba's assassination, even though there were people in his administration, he didn't know this, but people who had backed that, like the guy in charge of his own security, the guy in charge of the Treasury, the guy who was in charge of the Secret Service, Charles Dillon, right? Or Douglas Dillon. I think Douglas Dillon. And he's from the Dillon Reed banking family. They called for the creation of the CIA in the first place. The Dillon Reed bankers did. And he was part of Eisenhower's advisory panel on intelligence. And he told Eisenhower, yeah, you should get rid of this Patrice Lumumba in the Congo character. He's too close to communists, which means he wants to use the Congo's resource wealth for the Congolese people. And these are the policies that we've had in place. You overthrow and assassinate leaders like Lumumba. You put in corrupt puppets and who allow Western corporations to loot these countries. And these corrupt despots also put all of their ill-gotten money in the Western financial system and Western banks. I mean, it's just a way to run a neo-colonial system, and it kills many, many, many people. West Papua, they had this huge gold mine that the Rockefeller interests take over after the fact. but that's an enormous amount of wealth that they were able to acquire. So when Kennedy was killed, it was a massive windfall for the corporate rich, especially these neo-colonial minded people that want to go into the global south and take the resource riches and profit from them, while these people living there get nothing. Okay, this is how imperialism, Western imperialism, has functioned. And Kennedy wanted to do something different for, I think, for moral reasons, but also even for practical reasons. Empires generate their own downfall. If you study history, you know that all empires fall. And I think that, for realist reasons, or for idealist reasons, Kennedy wanted to wind this down, and avoid disaster. He didn't. And as a result, the country went in a totally different direction, very far. And I think Reagan was really the antithesis of Kennedy, and we have had Reaganite regimes, you know, U.S. empire, corporate America in charge regimes, ever since really the Kennedy assassination, and especially consolidated under Reagan, where now it's so corrupted by money and so unmistakably corporate throughout, that there's not much space for anything else. It's like it's something that has to be somehow, it has to collapse under its own weight now. There's just no room in the regime for this. That's a legacy of not just the Kennedy assassination, but that dark imperial impulse that animated the Kennedy assassination and other crimes afterwards, like the Vietnam War, like the 1965 slaughter of 1 million to 3 million Indonesian peasants, like the RFK assassination, the Malcolm X assassination, the MLK assassination, many other dark episodes of U.S. history, fueled by this dark impulse to be the global hegemon. My understanding is that it wasn't AIPAC, but it was like the Zionist Council of America or something like that. It was like a precursor to AIPAC, and they put a lot of energy into finally getting it registered as a foreign agent. I can't remember the outcome, if they ultimately succeed after Kennedy is gone or what, but I do. My understanding is that the same people essentially registered the American Israeli Political Action Committee in response to this, and it has functioned that way ever since. So it's like sort of true, but not technically what happened. It's Kennedy was against the biggest Israel lobby of his day not being registered as a foreign agent. And I think Robert Kennedy was concerned with that also. And Kennedy also was the the president who was most serious and really did try to stop Israel from getting a nuclear weapon, and really did try to come up with a solution for the Palestinian crisis, which I don't think that was the reason for his assassination, but I think it was part of the reason. I think it was really overdetermined in so many areas. You can see the policies he was pursuing and how they get reversed, and that basically tells you who killed him in a bigger sense. Yeah, the Warren Commission report was a whitewash. It was designed to be that way. I think Earl Warren knew that it was a whitewash, but he had been deceived by Lyndon Johnson into thinking that if he did not cover up the assassination that way, it could lead to a nuclear war, in which many, many people might die, the country might be destroyed. Who knows how bad it could be? And so Johnson deceives Warren into thinking that there's evidence pointing to a Soviet or Cuban hand behind Oswald. And so Warren thinks he's covering this up for, noble reasons. Really, the commission is run by the CIA director, Allen Dulles, who was probably the main suspect in the Kennedy assassination. He ran the CIA. He was fired by Kennedy. He ran an assassination apparatus within the CIA and all other sorts of horrible crimes. He hated Kennedy. Um, and he was, the day that Kennedy was died, according to one of his diaries, he was at the farm, which is a CIA training facility, where he was out of the CIA. So what was he doing at the farm? So the Warren Commission was really a farce, but it did collect a lot of testimony from different people, and included it in these 26 volumes. And as a result, there's a lot that you can use to falsify the government's claim just by looking at contradictions of its own testimony. People also complained that their testimony was changed by the Warren Commission. that they misrepresented what they said, or used different words, basically altered their testimony. And even one of the commissioners themselves, Richard Russell, a senator, he didn't believe it. He didn't believe the conclusions. He had a whole session where he laid out a presentation in which he explained why the magic bullet theory was a problem, and he had issues with Marina's testimony and other problems that suggested that that there had to be more to it than Oswald. And Dulles and everybody, the other people running things, they basically deceived him. There was the stenographer that was supposed to be taking notes was a fake. She didn't record anything, and it was never included. And so it was presented to the public as a unanimous, conclusion. But actually, the Democrats on the committee all were dissenters eventually, like the other Southerners, Hale Boggs, and I think John Cooper was the other guy. None of them believed it. And what's also notable about the Warren Commission is that there wasn't a single person who was really an ally of Kennedy politically on the committee. It was all centrist Republicans, or more conservative Republicans like John McCloy, or it was segregationist Democrats who would have had reason to hate Kennedy for, writing the Civil Rights Act, which eventually gets passed. So it's a very dubious process. It's a really shameful cover up. It's a whitewash of the assassination. There's plenty of evidence that points to it being a high level conspiracy. And what the Warren Commission did was try to cover that up. But they ultimately did a pretty bad job. Eventually, people like LBJ come to suspect the CIA. Richard Nixon thought that the people that killed Kennedy, he suspected it was the CIA. Robert F. Kennedy believed it was the CIA and the mafia and the Cubans, and that if he was president, he was going to reinvestigate it. The whole political class thinks it's a conspiracy, more or less, and then the public thinks it's a conspiracy. But the media and the politicians, when they speak publicly, they all accept this absurd Warren Commission conclusion with the magic bullet theory and everything else. So it's a sad moment in U.S. history, because it's the big lie gets established as national orthodoxy, and it's a horrific thing. The House Select Committee was the second investigation, and it was ill-fated in that it was going after very big fish. And even though it happened after Watergate, and it was the so-called Watergate Congress, a reformist Congress that was elected in 1974 in the wake of Watergate. They were the power of the forces that killed Kennedy was too much. They basically forced the first honest chair of the committee to resign, and the other person that they bring in is a person named Robert Blakey, who's written about the mafia and is basically a mafia person, and he tries to pin it on the mafia, more or less. The evidence of a conspiracy is so much that they can't really say there wasn't a conspiracy, so he attempts to pin it on the mafia. Even though other people that were a part of the team, like Dan Hardway, Ed Lopez, Gaten Fonzie, these people all believe that the CIA was deeply involved. There wasn't, they couldn't do anything about it. So they write a pretty unsatisfying report, and they classify a lot of important information also, just like the Warren Commission did. They just lock it up and say, you can't really see a lot of our deliberations. So on the one hand, at the very least, they ruled that Kennedy was killed by a probable conspiracy. JFK was. That's noteworthy. The problem is they asked the Justice Department to reinvestigate. The new president coming in, Ronald Reagan, is not going to do that. He represents the forces that killed Kennedy, essentially. And so that's where it stands. But at least they did establish that there was a conspiracy behind the assassination in Dallas. And when you look back at what happened during their investigation, it's really amazing. So many people that they're trying to investigate and interview just die during that time. George de Mohrenschildt, who was Oswald's best friend and was also happened to know Allen Dulles, going way back, was involved in illegal oil dealing with the Nazis as an intelligence asset during the war. This guy who makes no sense why he'd be friends with Oswald, and he was Oswald's best friend. He's going to be interviewed. He's talked about the conspiracy behind Oswald and how Oswald was a patsy. And just before the day that he's given a card from Gaten Fonzie, the investigator, he ends up committing suicide, quote unquote, probably similar to like Epstein's suicide, and the number two guy at the FBI under Hoover, William Sullivan, he had warned his friend, "Hey, if I'm ever killed, and they say it's like a weird accident, don't believe that. They got me." He ends up during this time period getting shot by a hunter who confused him for a deer while he was on his front porch, as I understand it. So that was strange. Johnny Rosselli, who's a mobster who had been part of the Cuban Castro assassination plots with the mafia, he had been talking about these things, and he was called, I think, to come back to the church committee, but that was at around the same time. He was going to testify more about these things, and they can't find him until he finally surfaces in a barrel in Biscayne Bay, which he has been chopped up and stuffed into. There's other ones I could go into, but it's quite astounding to look back at that history and see the efforts that go into this cover up for decades when you look at it. So the House Select Committee has a mixed but fascinating history. They ultimately fail, but it's still a very interesting and important time period to study. Well, this is a very difficult question. It gets into the way that the deep state has evolved over time. I believe that part of what happened after Watergate was that it became, and this is established in 1968. Peter Dale Scott has written about how there was a Council on Foreign Relations meeting where they said, these covert operations are getting kind of dicey. We need to make them less bureaucratic. What that really meant was we need to have less fingerprints that trace back to the US government. So some decision is made at that point in that vein, and the US starts to have intelligence scandals. Like some stories come out in Ramparts about the CIA working with these different outlets in ways that are kind of scandalous. You have revelations about the assassinations. You have all the Church Committee and Watergate revelations that show like all the dirty tricks the government is playing. So this should have led to an era where you had less clandestine chicanery, less sort of covert imperialism, right? But Ronald Reagan is ultimately what happens after Watergate. Reagan and the Reagan Revolution. The right is victorious, the empire is victorious, and you have all sorts of covert shenanigans going on. BCCI, Iran Contra, cocaine, all heroin dealing operations with U.S. proxies. The all the Al Qaeda business in the 90s, everything in the global war on terror era. You have even more clandestine activity. And so one of the things that has happened is the US outsources some of its most sensitive aspects to other intelligence agencies. So the Saudis at times have been used to carry out operations, especially those involving jihadis. Israel seems to have taken, if you look at Epstein and things like that, Israel seems to have taken over some of the most sensitive clandestine covert operations for blackmailing people, and who knows what else. We don't really know. They lie about what the operations are in the first place, and so they obviously conceal when they farm them out to foreign intelligence agencies like Mossad. But there's a lot of reason to believe, based on Ghislaine Maxwell's father and Epstein's background and so on, and his connections, that he was working for Mossad, but was also friendly and accommodated by U.S. intelligence and the CIA. The CIA probably appreciated having all of the blackmail opportunities. Now, the reason that I think Israel is ideal for these operations is that of all the constituencies within the U.S. empire, within the U.S. elite, there's a lot. Israel in America, Zionism in America is very powerful, and it is dedicated more than anybody else to the idea of a unipolar empire, meaning that there is only the U.S. and the U.S. empire, Western imperialism, and the Western system, the dollarized Western system, that runs things in the world. Israel needs that kind of a system because if not, then the nationalism of the places around Israel will make its existence untenable. Okay, they essentially invaded the Middle East. Some European Jewish people, mostly, people that we would think of as white people, Ashkenazi Jews, were the driving force behind the creation of Israel, and at some point they decide that there's no accommodation, or at least enough of them decide there's no accommodation with Palestine, and they have this pipe dream of greater Israel, and we see that playing out now with the assault on Gaza. But what I think that this did was it made Israel kind of indispensable to the most right-wing imperialist factions of the US empire. So it's at this point, when you talk about the neoconservative foreign policy consensus, it's difficult, if not impossible, to say where the American empire ends and where the Zionist project begins, because they've become kind of one and the same, to a degree that we can't know because of state secrecy. So we don't. I can't speak definitively about precisely what the relationship is, but it does seem that the U.S. has used Israel in this Faustian way, and the clandestine apparatus of Israel and other countries as well, but perhaps Israel uniquely so, in a way that gives them leverage over the United States. So I think that the reason the U.S. pursues policies counter really to the interests of the United States, even just as an empire, uh, is because of the influence of Zionism. That they are so a faction is so fanatically devoted to the idea of a greater Israel from the river to the sea that cannot accommodate the Palestinian people, and thus is essentially genocidal, that they're so devoted to that that they're kind of the perfect people to outsource the most sensitive and illegitimate clandestine practices to, because they are fanatically devoted to this. It's not just business for them. It is a kind of eschatological messianic crusade, which I think may help to explain the strange disproportionate power that they have and influence that they have within the US foreign policy establishment. So I think that that's a part of the puzzle. It's not just the Israel lobby. It's not just that they're useful to beat up on other governments in the region. I think that this clandestine part of it, and the fact that Israel probably has a lot of blackmail on the US establishment, perhaps even over the JFK assassination itself, that this is what gives them so much power. I mean, for a time, Johnny Rosselli, who we spoke about earlier, he was able to blackmail the U.S. by virtue of what he knew about the Kennedy assassination and the Castro assassination plots. But Israel, I think, has more damning information about things like that. And so they're not likely to meet the fate of Johnny Rosselli, who ended up chopped up in a barrel because his blackmail scheme didn't quite work. I think that there's some blackmail going on among these establishments, Israel vis-a-vis the more waspy U.S. establishment, that is a factor here. But we can't really know the details of it unless we have some really righteous truth and reconciliation process at some point. He was killed by the same people that killed JFK. Essentially, he was killed because what he was calling for, echoing Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was coming out against the Vietnam War, and he said we have to defeat the evil triplets of racism, militarism, and economic exploitation. Robert Kennedy in 1968, 67, really, he tells Martin Luther King, go and take all those people, march on Washington, and demand an end to the war and money for solving social problems. And Robert F. Kennedy runs on a campaign marrying MLK's evil triplets, saying that I want to fight. I'm for peace. I'm for racial reconciliation. I'm for economic justice. So he was really running within the establishment, but on its very edge, of course. He was running a campaign similar to what Martin Luther King was advocating. I think that the establishment has never been so terrified in the United States as they were in the spring of 1968. And in response, they kill Martin Luther King in April, and then they kill Robert Kennedy in June of 1968. And in the Robert Kennedy assassination, they use a Palestinian as the patsy, not a communist, but a Palestinian. I think that signifies, after the 1967 war, perhaps after the Kennedy assassination and peripheral involvement in that. I don't think that they killed JFK, but they may have been responsible for Ruby dealing with that problem for the U.S. But I think Israel, the fact that a Palestinian was the patsy in the RFK assassination, says that something changed within the upper echelons of the U.S. deep state. And that he was clearly not killed by Sirhan, because Sirhan was out of position, a few feet in front of Robert Kennedy, whereas Robert Kennedy was killed by a bullet fired at point blank range from behind, right to left, apparently by somebody standing right behind him with a gun to the back of his head, immediately behind him, probably a security guard, probably Thane Caesar, who ended up going to the Philippines and had worked for Ace Security. He seems to have connections to Mayhew, Robert Mayhew, same person who was responsible for the Castro mafia assassination plots. So it's in some ways it's more obvious than the JFK assassination. Sirhan could not possibly have killed RFK. That is established by the autopsy and eyewitness statements, and yet we can do nothing about it. Yeah, Chaos is really fascinating. I listened to the audiobook version of it and could do it again because I'm not that familiar with the Manson case. And so some of those Manson names were a little bit tricky for me to follow. But I think that it's astounding that there were these Manson's parole and many things about the way he was treated by the prison system and so on seem to point to an intelligence connection. Additionally, with Operation Chaos and related activities that the clandestine state was, embarking on at that time period, I mean, we know that they were trying to undermine the Black Panthers and the New Left and the counterculture. And the Manson operation is such a spectacle because it's like he's trying to start a race war, and also with all the acid and the hippie things, he's really discrediting the New Left, discrediting the anti-war movement, discrediting the counterculture. So, I mean, what ends up happening in 1968? You have a law and order president, a guy who wins because he makes an appeal of like being against these dangerous hippies, law and order, and against these race riots and so on. So somebody like Manson seems like and the Manson family, it just seems like a kind of Gladio type of spectacle, which is where the U.S. used to use terror attacks in Europe, like in Italy, the Bologna railway station bombing or the Piazza Fontana bombing, in order to discredit communism and make the state and the right seem sensible. Manson, I think, had a similar effect in the U.S. and his connections to apparent CIA programs and people like Jolyon West, who was an MK Ultra scientist who once killed an elephant with LSD and who uh, was somehow called in to help to diagnose Jack Ruby. And he said, "Oh, Jack Ruby's insane. He's lost his mind, right?" But why would the CIA be sending in a MK Ultra scientist to talk to Jack Ruby? It's really quite remarkable. And this all relates to what Manson was doing and the kind of covert operations he may have been involved in. And it does appear circumstantially, based on what Tom O'Neill lays out, that chaos was some kind of Gladio version of the United States. In the United States, like what they did in Europe and what the covert operations we've deployed around the world, that seems to have been deployed in the U.S. in with events like the Manson murders. And they, of course, never get to the bottom of it. And you wonder if Manson even totally understood who he was working for. I mean, really dark, horrific stuff that he was in. And there's other episodes like this too, where there seem to be some during this time period where there seems to be some intelligence angle that you're never able to get to the bottom of. But you think about Jonestown and his connections to the establishment and some of the techniques of persuading followers and stuff to be this part of a screwball organization for whatever purpose. Seems like things the CIA would do. The Symbionese Liberation Army, the connections between that and people like I think Colton Westbrook, right? People that were involved with the national security state. All of these things that happen in this time period that seem to be shocking to the American public, like they're being terrorized more or less, in ways that help you to answer, like when you think, how could Richard Nixon be elected in 68 and then win by a landslide in 1972? But a lot of crazy events had been happening and psychologically conditioning the US public for this kind of a move to the right. Uh, and further away from the people that were assassinated, like Robert Kennedy and MLK and JFK and Malcolm X, and more towards this dark kind of fascism in disguise. That seems to be the outcome of these kinds of spectacles, and they do seem to be congruent with psychological operations and paramilitary, operations that we've carried out with Gladio in Europe and across the world, really. So I think that there's Netflix documentary coming out based on the Manson murders that Earl Morris is doing, and I would have said that he would probably make a terrible documentary because he's, got some liberal tendencies, but he did a pretty good job with Wormwood, surprised me with that, so I actually have some faith in this. I don't think it's a project you'd even wanna pick up if you weren't persuaded by Tom O'Neill, and there's also a new Netflix documentary on the octopus. So I'm hopeful that these glaring glitches in the matrix, these different impactful political conspiracies are starting to be acknowledged, and maybe on some level they're trying to inject this into the political discussion because it no longer serves the purpose that it once had. The empire is not really tenable anymore to run the world, and that was the reason for all of this chicanery. And it's also making US society difficult to manage politically or be a functional society anymore. And if it's not part of a bigger imperial project, what justifies it anymore? So I'm hopeful that we will learn more about some of these things in coming years because there's it's the issue of state criminality, high criminality, being politically impactful, historically impactful. This is something that we and our political system has not been able to address. And it's like a family tragedy or dark part of the family history that just you can never move past because we can't say that it ever happened. And I think when you look at these sort of conspiratorial episodes, it's more important than just like a true crime investigation or trying to figure out who done it or whatever. It's instructive in understanding the nature of this of the system we live under of our system of governance, and it's something we're going to have to confront and change if we want to reform this, which I think everybody now understands that if you're honest at all, this system needs fundamental reform, and we need to actually have some truth and reconciliation in American politics. Operation Gladio was initially a series of sort of military intelligence enterprises across Europe that was undertaken in order to allow for some sort of French resistance to pop up, like the French resisted the Nazis. The idea was that if the Soviets ever come across and take over these countries, you'll have a ready-made insurgency to fight for freedom. But the prospect of a Soviet invasion was always exaggerated, and you can find people like George Kennan and others arguing like, "Yeah, they're not going to invade. It's like there's no risk of an imminent invasion." But they wanted a anti-communist kind of shock troop army across Europe, and so they rehabilitated or rescued really a lot of fascists and Nazis, and they established networks through the intelligence services and the organized crime networks and different oligarchs to have a whole system of networks that were there as a kind of secret paramilitary police. I will use Gladio more as a shorthand just to talk about the secret U.S. clandestine regime that really runs, Europe. You could call it NATO, you could call it the U.S. empire, you could call it Gladio, whatever you want to say about it. But I tend to use Gladio more to signify more than what the actual first mission was. But it has been a way to. It's like whatever the dark force is that killed Kennedy in the United States, that is run by the empire and it's part of the apparatus that they use to control politics. The way that is created in Europe and maintained in Europe is what we could call Gladio. So it's essentially occupied by NATO. I mean, I think the NATO and the US really has the veto power over European politics. And in practice, what that has meant is you have occasional terror bombings in order to discredit groups and encourage people to submit to the state essentially for security. And you also have assassinations of leaders who get too far out off the reservation. So you had Aldo Moro, who was about to create a left-wing coalition government in Italy, even though he was told by people like Henry Kissinger, "Hey, if you do this, you're going to die." He did it anyway, and then he was killed supposedly by communists. But who's pulling their strings? You have the assassination of Olof Palme in Sweden. He was the most internationalist progressive statesman in the 1980s, really in Europe. He wanted rapprochement with Cuba. He was really a figure who wanted better policies in the third world, etc. You also had the Alfred Herrhausen assassination in the late 80s in Germany. He was an elite German banker who wanted something different for after the Cold War. He wanted public investment, not the sort of neoliberal shock therapy. He wanted more integration with Russia in a constructive way in Eastern Europe. And he was blown up with a very, very sophisticated car bomb. Had to be the work of military professionals, and it gets blamed on Red Guards, Red Brigades, communists. So supposedly the most progressive, enlightened banker probably in the history of modern history of Europe uh, gets assassinated by communists supposedly because he wants a less capitalist, less imperialist post Cold War order in Germany, Russia, and Eastern Europe. It's not really plausible, but again, it's a ridiculous cover story that's out there in the historical record. And we can't do anything about it. I would say that's Gladio in action. We could think of the Nord Stream bombing in the same way. So it's more or less the sort of fascism in disguise that the U.S. maintains, but it's the European franchise for that.